Let's talk about the Broadway box office grosses for week ending March 26, 2023, because hi, I'm Brian, the business analyst, and these numbers, as always, are courtesy of the Broadway League. So let's start with the overall picture with a few key call-outs. First is you will see a lot of shows are down from the previous week, but it is important to note the week prior was spring break for most schools outside of New York, as the tri-state area spring break typically falls between Easter and Passover, or Passover and Easter, which is coming up in the next 2 weeks, which is when we'll see a lot of grosses perk up again. Next, as Phantom of the Opera begins its final month of performances on Broadway, it broke another house record at the Majestic Theater, bringing in approximately $3.57 million in ticket sales last week. And I would expect it to continue to break house records for at least the next 2 weeks. I don't know if it's going to break a house record for its final week of performances, since only 5 of them are going to be publicly available, but we'll see. Talk about the rest of the shows on the list. First, we have Anne Juliet, which seems like it's the only new musical this season that will not be dependent on the Tony Awards to sell tickets, as despite being down about 9% in terms of gross sales last week and 5% in terms of capacity, which equated to it being down about $111,000, it's still playing to nearly packed houses, bringing in approximately $1.1 million, which has been relatively consistent since it began performances on Broadway last year. A Beautiful Noise, which is like an anormality on this because it was one of the few shows that was up week over week, which is hard to explain, bringing in about $962,000, up over $100,000 from the previous week. But it's also an anormality because it, despite bringing in nearly $1 million a week, it's playing to one of the lowest capacities on Broadway in one of the mid to lower sized houses. So it's clear producers are preferring to have a select number of high-paying individuals see the show instead of having a full house, which is the exact opposite approach we're seeing with a show like Shucked, which I'll get to later. Next, we have the Jessica Chastain-led revival of A Doll's House, which opened to relatively solid reviews and is doing relatively well, bringing in nearly $900,000, and grosses rose by about $16,000 last week, and it's a show with no set. So, it's making money. I don't know how much Jessica's making each week, but it's probably making money. Next, we have Bad Cinderella, which was relatively flat to last week, but it is important to note that there were a lot of press seats and comps given out for opening night. Time will tell, though, as while despite playing to a 91% capacity, its average ticket price was about $61, which is because Bad Cinderella, like Shucked, which we'll get to later, is playing to reduce prices during its preview period. The real question for Bad Cinderella at this point is, will it be able to get audiences to pay more for a ticket, considering the reviews it got? But I wouldn't count it out yet because we've seen what its marketing team has already done with the Bethany Frankel ad. And note, reviews really don't affect your show's immediate grosses for at least 2 weeks. We might see, not an increase in grosses, but it's hard to tell their impact for at least about 2 weeks. Next, we have the Lincoln Center revival of Camelot, which is doing extremely well, bringing about $860,000 last week, which is about over $100,000 from the previous week. But note, that increase is stemming from the fact it played an additional performance last week and is now playing a full 8-performance week. But for me personally, I'm just astounded by how well it's doing, but I do have to remember the fact that Lincoln Center has a reputation for doing these lush revivals, and that is likely what it is being sold on for those patrons. As one thing to remember, reputation is key in entertainment. So people are willing to pay top dollar if they know they're going to get a good show, which Lincoln Center has clearly trained audiences in that fact. Next, we have Kimberly Kimbo, that was up slightly to last week in terms of gross sales, although it was down in terms of capacity. One important thing to note when you're looking at Kimberly Kimbo, as its grosses are nearly half that of any other musical on Broadway, is the fact it's playing the Booth Theater, which is one of the smallest theaters on Broadway. But also because it's playing one of the smallest houses on Broadway, we have no idea if it's making money or losing money, but based on the fact it's been playing to 95+% capacity throughout the entire winter, I have to assume its break-even is around $500,000 a week. So I think it's definitely in a great place going into award season, which is where I think producers are definitely expecting it to shine, as tickets are not on sale for after the Tony Awards. So I expect, as of May 2nd, when the Tony nominations are announced, they release the block of ticket sales over the summer and jack up their ticket prices. Next, we have Leopoldstadt, which was relatively flat to the week prior, but it is down at least 40% from what it was playing to a few months ago. And as such, I know some have questioned whether it was smart to extend the show's run into the summer, but I think it's a vanity production. I think we all knew it was a vanity production to begin with, and the reason why it was extending was in hopes of making money, but I also think it was because it's very rare for a show to win Best Play if it isn't open on Broadway. And I by no means think the show is losing money, or at least significant amount of money. Next, we have Life of Pi, which I saw last week for $15 through ShowScore, and it is down to the week prior. But if you look at its reviews, which are being released as I make this, it's receiving glowing reviews, and it is clearly going for the awards play. As like I said last week, it will likely clean up at the Tony Awards, especially in the technical categories, so they are willing to play at a loss for now in hopes of recouping over the summer. Some of the strongest previews we've seen on Broadway in a while, especially from a musical with no stars. So clearly, Lin-Manuel Miranda can sell a Broadway musical. It will be interesting to see how the show holds up, because first previews typically sell very well, and it only had 2 performances last week, both of which were on the weekend. So we'll see how it does this week. Next, you have Parade. Which is grosses were up about 8%, but we have to remember they did have a canceled performance the week prior as well as opening night. So bringing 1.1 million does sound great, but we also have to remember for the show to recoup its investment by the end of its run, I think it needs to bring in 1.3 million, and that is only if Jason Robert Brown and the entire creative team forego royalties. But also, like I said last week, I don't know how Parade is going to do in the long run, because it very much feels like a Sondheim type show, because it is one of the toughest musicals to sell in the history, because it is such a depressing piece. And as like, I have a feeling it's going to play like a Sondheim revival, which typically do really well for the first 2 months, and then the grosses start to tank as the highbrow theater-going audience starts to get eaten up. Although from what I've heard, Ben Platt has been the driving force of sales and not the piece itself, so that might play to its advantage. Next we have Peter Pan Goes Wrong, which was up about $100,000 from the week prior. It is important to note a lot of that is stemming from the fact it did play additional performances last week, as it is in previews, and preview schedules are staggered. This was first announced. I know several of you commented that you couldn't believe how much they were trying to charge for tickets, and that seems to be panning out, as it only played to a 74% capacity, despite the fact that Mischief Theater has a cult following, and it should be very easily selling out, and I'm surprised it isn't following the Shucked model, which we'll get to in a little bit. But also it's surprising considering the fact that that's also the model that The Play That Goes Wrong did, where they were like handing out tickets to anybody who wanted them to build up that word of mouth in order to sell more tickets. But one thing to note is this is truly a limited run, as they also announced this past week. It will be doing a LA engagement in August, so there's really no room for it to extend on Broadway. So this is just, they're in, they're out. They're trying to make money as quickly as possible. Next, we have Shucked, which is an interesting case, which I mentioned previously, is because lead producer Mike Bosner did give interviews talking about how they have a different pricing strategy during previews, and they're exceeding it because they wanted to have much lower prices during previews to pack the houses, because that's where comedy does well. It plays well when the house is full. And so it's clearly doing that. It's playing to near capacity crowds. But the one concerning factor is, yes, it was up about $60,000 in the week prior, but its actual price average was only up about 90 cents. For the show to break even, I would suspect it has to have an average ticket price of about like $75 to $80 a week. So that is a large gap to fill once it opens next Tuesday, but we'll see if it can do it, because the word of mouth coming out of Shucked seems to be really great. The question is, will audiences be willing to pay more to see it? Next, we have Some Like It Hot, which is grosses were only down slightly. Maybe it is finally starting to find its audience. It had brought in about $925,000 last week. And like I said last week, its grosses have been all over the place. But it's a show that definitely likely needs a Tony win or very great publicity from the award season to survive the summer. As despite the fact that it's brought in over $900,000 last week, it still had one of the lowest capacities on Broadway. Yes, it's playing in one of the largest houses, but playing to only an 80% capacity never looks good. Also, this is just my honest opinion, I think they're misselling the show. The show needs to be sold in the fact that it's celebrating black women, strong black women. It is a show that celebrates black joy, very similar to how Fat Ham is celebrating black culture, but it's stuck trying to sell itself to boomers. Like, I know this, I need to do a review for Some Like It Hot still, but like, this is what I'm saying, like, Some Like It Hot is what people want when they say they want a show like this. It's Some Like It Hot. I'm not seeing that marketing because I'm not in those spaces, but that is what I would suggest to their marketing team. They need to get into black spaces and tell them there's this wonderful show celebrating black life and black culture on Broadway. Sweeney Todd, which did fall about $300,000 in the week prior, but that is also because it did open last week, so there were a lot of comps given out for a show that was not papering at all. So I expect its grosses to jump significantly this week. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions or want me to go more in depth on any of my analyses. I know not many people watch these videos, but like, they're some of my favorites because I spend legit hours looking at Broadway grosses each week.